Good evening. I am Uyai, and I can come to you live from Uyo, the capital city of Akwa Ibom State, Nigeria. Today on Spotlight Africa, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris pledges millions to fight jihadists on Africa tour. Chadian President pardons 259 jailed protesters. Abiy hails peace deal to talk to other armed groups. Son of Uganda's Museveni to retire from army this year. Plus, Ethiopian nun and piano queen dies at 99. The stories are all just ahead on Spotlight Africa. Do stay with us. Thanks for joining us. First in Spotlight Africa, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has announced $100 million to support the fight against Islamist militants in West Africa, while in Ghana, at the start of her three-nation tour of Africa. The coastal countries of Ghana, Benin, Ivory Coast and Togo are to benefit from the package. The region has been facing security threats from the ever-advancing jihadists operating in the Sahel. Vice President Harris acknowledged Ghana's leadership role on the continent and said that America was willing to invest more to promote economic growth. She indicated that her visit to Ghana was not because of China's influence in Africa, but rather to strengthen bilateral ties with its partners. Her visit comes at a time African countries are recovering from the global pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. President Nana Akufo-Addo had expressed concerns about the presence of Russian mercenaries in some West African countries and the need for Africa to solve its problems on its own. Ghana struggling with inflation, which has hit over 50%. In a related development, a Ghanaian president, Nana Akufo-Addo, on Monday said an anti-gay bill being debated in parliament has been modified following his government's intervention. Speaking during a joint news conference with the visiting U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, Akufo-Addo said the bill was not official government policy, but rather had been put forward by a handful of private members. He said the Attorney General had submitted opinions to a parliamentary committee about the constitutionality or otherwise of several of its provisions. Meanwhile, President Akufo-Addo refused to say what he would do if the bill passed and hoped the parliament would consider the sensitivity of the human rights aspect. Meanwhile, Chadian President Mahamat Idris Deby Itno on Monday pardoned 259 people out of the 262 jailed in December during deadly confrontations between police and protesters in the capital, N'Djamena. They had been convicted for offenses including unauthorized assembly, destruction of property, arson, violence, and assault during the clashes in which 73 people died. It comes days after 380 rebels sentenced to life for the death of former ruler Idris Deby Itno, the current president's father, were also pardoned in an apparent peace gesture. The late Idris Deby died during an operation against rebels in 2021. He had ruled the country for 30 years. In the meantime, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has called the peace deal signed between his government and fighters from the northern Tigray region a positive step and said his government would also sit down with other armed groups. Abiy was addressing members of parliament today in Addis Ababa. During the session, a number of lawmakers raised concerns about growing insecurity in other parts of the country, pervasive corruption, and the cost of living crisis. According to him, several efforts have been made in recent months to reach out to the Oromo Liberation Front (OLF), an insurgent group operating in the country's Oromia region, to make a peaceful resolution. There has not been any immediate reaction from the OLF regarding the Prime Minister's claim. The 2-year civil war in Tigray and neighboring regions is believed to have claimed more than 500,000 lives. Moving away from that, the post-election power struggle between President William Ruto and his opposition rival Raila Odinga has taken a significant turn. This is not the first time Raila Odinga has organized large-scale protests against election results. In 2018, the then-President Uhuru Kenyatta built an alliance with him and went on to support him in last year's vote. Unlike previous post-election protests, Odinga and Kenyatta found themselves the targets of violence. The looters at the Kenyatta farm said it was retaliation for losses made by businesses due to the protests organized by Odinga and which they say are sponsored by Kenyatta. In the meantime, hundreds of people have stormed former President Uhuru Kenyatta's farm on the outskirts of Kenya's capital, Nairobi. They have cut down trees using power saws, stolen livestock, and set the farm on fire. The motive is still unknown. This comes amid opposition protests in Kenya against the administration of President William Ruto. Meanwhile, Kenya's opposition leader Raila Odinga has condemned the invasion of the property of the former President Uhuru Kenyatta. In an interview with newsmen, he said he believed the attack was carried out by goons hired by the government. Kenyatta is an ally of Odinga. Monday was the second day of anti-government protests called for by Odinga over claims he was cheated at the last election, as well as rising living costs in the country. The looting of Kenyatta's large farm is seen as retaliation for his support for Odinga. Meanwhile, more protests are planned on Thursday, but the government has condemned the violence and disruption caused by the demonstrations. In a related development, police in Kenya have visited a farm owned by the family of former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta after it was partially burned by invaders on Monday. The looters felled trees and carried away sheep from the farm that is located on the outskirts of the capital, Nairobi. Armed police officers present did not intervene. Police officers visited the farm and assessed the damage, but have been criticized on social media for acting too late. Media footage from the farm showed workers demolishing iron sheet structures that had been erected by the invaders. In the meantime, while covering protests in Kibera area of Kenya's capital, Nairobi, a group of national and international journalists were attacked and robbed at knife point by a gang. A journalist with the Nation Media Group said he was forced to delete his photos by the police while monitoring events in downtown Nairobi. He says his press card was destroyed too. According to reports, 2 journalists with Africa Uncensored, a media company specializing in investigations, were detained in the back of a truck by police for 30 minutes. They were released and went to cover the looting at a farm owned by the Kenyatta family. Still in Kenya, one person has been shot dead in Kenya's western city of Kisumu as demonstrators turned out to protest against the high cost of living. There have also been clashes between protesters and the police in informal settlements in Nairobi. The government has deployed security forces to quell the demonstrations called by opposition leader Raila Odinga, but this has only served to further inflame tensions. Meanwhile, the Interior Ministry and Inspector of Police have termed the protest illegal. President William Ruto is currently on an official visit to Belgium and Germany. Meanwhile, Kenya's Interior Ministry is proposing changes to security laws that will make it more difficult for people to hold protests. The Constitution gives Kenyans the right to assemble, demonstrate, and picket, but the participants must be peaceful and unharmed. Protests held last week in opposition strongholds left one university student dead after police used tear gas and live ammunition to disperse crowds. The changes proposed by the ministry seeks to limit the number of people holding protests at any particular occasion and makes protesters pay the cost of cleaning up. Protesters must also seek consent from the people affected by the protest. The demonstrators will also be liable for paying damages to those harmed by their activities. In the proposed changes, the Interior Ministry also seeks the demarcation of areas where people can assemble and hold protest. In another development, the African Union has appealed for claim and called for dialogue following opposition protests in Kenya that have turned violent and left 3 people dead since last week. Opposition leader Raila Odinga called for demonstrations to protest against the high cost of living and what he calls electoral justice after last year's election. In a statement, African Union Chairperson Mauza Faki Mahamat urged stakeholders to exercise calm and engage in dialogue to address any differences. He said the conduct of elections last year was successful and the outcome confirmed by the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, Kenyan religious leaders have also called for unconditional talks between President William Ruto and Odinga. Hotel Rwanda hero lands in Qatar after prison release. Stay tuned for details of this and more after this time out. Thanks for staying tuned in now to the rest of the news. Frederick Mark Palm, one of the main suspects accused of attempting to overthrow the Ghanaian government in 2019, has died. Reports say he collapsed in his house and was rushed to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. Mark Palm and 2 others were arrested in September of 2019 for allegedly plotting to destabilize the country. He was the owner of the Citadel Clinic, where security officials reportedly seized several weapons, ammunition, and explosive devices. In a separate development, Burkina Faso authorities have ordered France 24 broadcast off air following an interview with the head of Al-Qaeda militant group's North Africa wing, ACOIM. According to Burkina Faso's Minister of Communication, Jean-Emmanuel, in a statement, France 24 is not only acting as a mouthpiece for these terrorists, but worse, it is providing a space for the legitimization of terrorist actions and hate speech. He said the government had therefore decided in all responsibility and in the name of the superior interest of the nation to suspend indefinitely the transmission of France 24 programs on national territory. Recall that France 24 aired the interview with AQIM's leader Zaid Memberek earlier this month after France killed its predecessor in an air raid. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso expelled French troops who had been unsuccessfully fighting the Islamists, inviting Russian mercenaries in their stead. In the meantime, military and civilian political leaders in Sudan have begun talks in Khartoum on bringing the government-backed militia and the RSF under control of the army. The talks were part of an agreement signed in December, meant to pave the way for a return to democratic rule and due to be adopted formally in less than 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the army chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who seized power in a coup 2 years ago, said he wants to put an end to the armed forces supporting dictatorial governments in Sudan. Meanwhile, the eldest son of Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni says he will be retiring from the army this year after almost 3 decades of service. Mozu Kengagaba, an army general, made the announcement in a Twitter post. He made a similar announcement on Twitter in March last year when he was the commander of land forces, but the army said it had not officially received Kengagaba's retirement request. His latest retirement remarks comes days after he deleted a tweet announcing that he will stand for the presidency in 2026. The tweeting general has not hidden his ambition to take over the top job from his 78-year-old father, who has led Uganda since 1986. The Ugandan law does not allow serving soldiers to participate in politics. Elsewhere, a prominent Ethiopian composer who was also a nun has died in Jerusalem, where she had lived reclusively in an Ethiopian monastery for nearly 40 years. Emohe Segwe Mariam was 99. Often referred to as the piano queen, she was ordained as a nun at the age of 21 and was among Ethiopia's first classical pianists. According to reports, her first record was released in the mid-1960s when Ethiopia had a thriving jazz and classical music scene. Emohe Segwe Mariam achieved global fame in 2006 when her music featured in albums of Ethiopian music from previous decades. The Homeless Wanderer and The Madman's Laughter are among her well-known compositions. In the meantime, a security officer in Guinea has been sentenced to 10 years in prison for the murder of a 19-year-old. Moriba Kamara shot dead Fierno Mamado Diallo during opposition coalition protest last June. The prosecution had sought a longer sentence of 25 years in jail for Kamara, and the victim's brother reportedly said the court's lesser sentence of 10 years was too light for such a crime. Since 2021, Guinea has been governed by military leaders who pushed out ex-president Alpha Condé in a coup. In August last year, the junta banned the influential FNDC opposition coalition, which had led earlier protests against Condé and also against the new military rulers. Meanwhile, Paul Rusesabagina, who was portrayed as a hero in the Hollywood film Hotel Rwanda, has arrived in Qatar after being released from prison in his home country, Rwanda. The White House official said Rusesabagina left Rwanda on Monday and had arrived in Qatari capital Doha. Talks brokered by Qatar led to his release from prison on Friday, 2 years after he was sentenced to 25 years for terrorism. His supporters called the trial a sham. The sentence was commuted by presidential order, according to a government spokesperson. It followed years of diplomatic pressure by the U.S., where Rusesabagina had lived since 2009. Meanwhile, he is credited with saving some 1,200 people during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Lastly, on Spotlight Africa, the recipient of this year's Polar Music Prize, widely regarded as industry's equivalent of a Nobel Prize, have just been announced. The founder of Island Records, Chris Blackwell, who is credited with bringing Bob Marley to a global audience, has been awarded. The other winners are the Beninese singer Angelique Kidjo and the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, who last year regained the title of the most performed living composer. The award celebrates the 3 laureates for their achievements in music. It is the 3rd time in the history of the award that 3 laureates have won. Sir Paul McCartney, Bob Dylan and Dizzy Gillespie have all won in the past. The award was created by ABBA's manager Sting Anderson. And that's all we have for you at this time. Do ensure to follow us on social media and subscribe to our YouTube channel, all of which you can find on our website, spectrumtv.ng. You have been watching Spotlight Africa. My name is Uyai Anyeke. Thanks for watching, and I do hope you have a great evening.